Hello again everyone, and welcome back to LearnLinuxTV. In today's video, I'm going to give you guys a full review of the RasPad 3. The RasPad 3 is a kit that turns your Raspberry Pi 4 into a full Linux tablet. And I'm really excited to give you guys a review of this unit because I had a lot of fun checking it out. In a previous video, I showed you guys an unboxing of the RasPad 3 as well as the entire assembly process. And now with the RasPad all set and assembled, and considering I've had some additional time to spend with this device, I'm finally ready to give you guys a full review, which again is exactly what I'm going to be doing today. In fact, I have it right here in front of me. Here is the RasPad 3. This is what the assembled version looks like right here. And currently it's running Ubuntu 21.04, but I'm going to be showing you guys additional distributions in this review. I'm going to be trying a total of 3. Now, I'm really excited to dive in and review the RasPad 3, but before I do, a quick disclaimer. This device was actually provided to me and sent to the studio by SunFounder, the manufacturer of the RasPad 3, and even though it was provided to me by the manufacturer directly, all of the opinions in this video are my own, and they were not allowed to see this video before you guys, so they are seeing this video for the very first time, the same time that you guys are seeing this for the very first time. And also, just as an aside, I always retain full creative control of all the videos on my channel, and any company that sends me a product for review is doing so at their own risk. I'll always tell you guys exactly what I think of the product, even if I don't like it. So with that disclaimer out of the way, let's dive into the review. First of all, the RasPad is a very interesting device, to say the least. It is a tablet, but it's nothing like what you'd normally think of when you think of a tablet. The very first thing you'll notice is that it's very thick. It's easily the thickest tablet I've ever used. And I understand that because there's no way it could have been made to be slimmer than it is. After all, it needs to be thick enough to hold a Raspberry Pi Model 4, which is what's inside. This device features a touchscreen IPS display with a resolution of 1280 by 800. It has support for screen rotation. It has built-in stereo speakers, and it provides up to 5 hours of battery life. And this tablet has quite a few very interesting features. For example, there's a battery life indicator on the right-hand side that allows you to check how much battery is remaining without even having to turn on the tablet. And that light in particular will blink when the device is charging. On the left-hand side, we have access to all of the ports that we would normally have access to on a Raspberry Pi, with the only exception being that one of the HDMI ports is dedicated for the internal screen, so you only actually have access to one HDMI port from the side. But it is a full HDMI port in this case, which is great considering that cables for that are much easier to find. And I really enjoy having all of these ports accessible on this tablet. There's just something really cool about plugging an Ethernet cable into a tablet, of all things. And with access to the USB ports, that means you could plug in something like a flash drive, or essentially any other device that you would normally plug into a USB port. For the operating system, the RasPad 3 has its own dedicated OS, which is called RasPad OS. You don't actually have to use RasPad OS though. You could run other distributions that you would normally run on a Raspberry Pi, such as Raspberry Pi OS, Ubuntu, or whatever you'd like. Earlier in the video, I mentioned that I tried 3 different distributions, so later in the video, I'm going to tell you what my experience was like going outside of the intended operating system for this tablet. And assembling the device is very easy. You just follow the instructions that are inside the booklet. I also have a dedicated build video that's already on my channel, and I'll put a card for that right about here if you want to check that out. And that video will walk you through the entire process. In summary, to assemble this device, you first remove the cover, you attach the included cables to the chassis, and the other end of those cables into the Raspberry Pi. The cables are a bit stiff, so you'll definitely want to make sure that you screw in the Raspberry Pi as the final step. Now, when you go through the process of assembling the RasPad 3, just make sure that you are extremely careful around the speakers, because there's nothing protecting them if your hand slips and you send a screwdriver through one of the speakers. That would not be a fun experience. The overall process doesn't take more than a few minutes, so just take your time and you'll be fine. Now let's talk about operating systems. The first OS I tried was RasPad OS, which, as I mentioned, is the intended operating system for the RasPad 3. Now, there's no requirement to actually use RasPad OS, so you can completely ignore that if you'd like and use whatever your favorite Raspberry Pi operating system happens to be. But RasPad OS was the first one I checked into. And overall, it's fine. It's not my favorite distribution, to be honest with you, but if you're going to be primarily using the RasPad for its intended purpose of being a tablet, then using a tablet-focused distribution makes sense. While I was using RasPad OS, I felt like pretty much everything was custom, which isn't in and of itself a problem, but there was a bit of a learning curve. But I couldn't wait to try other distributions on this device, and the first alternative I tried was Raspberry Pi OS. And it works very well with this kit. Now, I'm not going to talk about performance here because the RasPad uses a Raspberry Pi, so it's not really going to make any difference in performance at all. Your performance will vary depending on which Raspberry Pi 4 you decided to go with. There's several versions with different sizes of memory, and also which SD card you decided to use with the kit. The better the SD card, the better the performance. As far as compatibility is concerned, the automatic rotation didn't work for me at all in Raspberry Pi OS, and I'm pretty sure I read somewhere that rotation is only supported on RasPad OS. Now that's okay with me because rotation isn't actually something I ever plan to use on a tablet. Even on a dedicated tablet, rotation is the first thing I usually disable, so not having rotation in Raspberry Pi OS was not something that bothered me at all. When I first installed Raspberry Pi OS, I wasn't expecting the touchscreen capability to work without some sort of tweak or driver, but actually it worked out of the box without me having to do a single thing. The thing is, though, the GUI on Raspberry Pi OS is very much a mouse-driven interface, so it can be kind of hard to use the touchscreen sometimes because you're attempting to move a mouse cursor with your finger, and it does work, but it just feels odd. But being able to use a desktop-focused distribution on the RasPad is really cool. And that means, depending on your intended focus, you can use something like Raspberry Pi OS if you want to use it as a portable desktop, or if you want to use it as a tablet, its intended purpose, then you can stick with RasPad OS. I think pretty much everybody that's been following my channel for a decent amount of time knew I would do this. I'm a huge fan of retro gaming, and RetroPie is a distribution that is meant for Raspberry Pi with a focus on allowing you to play your classic games. It's actually my favorite Linux distribution because it's just so much fun. So I pretty much try to run it on just about everything. Now, if nothing else, it's yet another excuse to show off Final Fantasy VI in a video. I mean, it's the best game ever made, and if you didn't already know that, now you do. But in all honesty, having a portable retro gaming machine is a really cool thing. Sure, there are dedicated portable RetroPie build units you can buy, but I think it's also really cool to have a multi-purpose unit that you can use for both work and play. When you want to play games, you can simply switch the SD card to a RetroPie SD card with your favorite games already on it, and play games on the go. I'll talk about the overall pros and cons of the RasPad later on in the video, but playing games on it really makes me wish that it had some sort of kickstand or prop. But I did have a tablet stand lying around that I decided to use with this device, and this one works okay, I guess. It's really hard to find a tablet stand that's wide enough to fit this particular tablet, considering the bottom edge is a bit wider than most tablets are. So it might be a challenge to find a stand since they're usually made for things like iPads and Chrome OS tablets anyways. So if you want to use a stand, just make sure you buy one that has a little bit more clearance than most of them do. While playing games on this device, I noticed that the screen resolution works extremely well for this use case. While it is kind of a downside that the included display is not full HD, the smaller resolution in this case means that older games won't have to be stretched as much in order to fit the screen, and that makes the pixels look very sharp. The speakers are also pretty good for this use case as well. Now, they're not going to be the best speakers that you've ever heard. For example, there's not a lot of bass, but they do sound good, and even when I cranked the volume, it didn't really sound staticky or garbled or anything, it just sounds fine. But anyway, having a portable RetroPie unit is a really great idea. In fact, if you don't care that this device isn't portable to the point that it won't fit in your pocket, it very well might be the best unit for portable retro gaming I've ever used. In addition, I also decided to try out Ubuntu on the RasPad as well, specifically the desktop version of Ubuntu 2104. And again, the performance here is going to be the same as any other installation of Ubuntu 2104 on a Raspberry Pi, because this is Ubuntu running on a Raspberry Pi. Just like with Raspberry Pi OS, the touchscreen works out of the box in Ubuntu 2104, and rotation doesn't work at all. I'm sure there's a way to get rotation working in distributions outside of RasPad OS, but I didn't have enough time to figure it out before I was scheduled to record this video. Now, this is actually my first time trying out Ubuntu 2104 on a Raspberry Pi, and I was fairly impressed with it. The GNOME desktop is a bit sluggish on the Pi though, but I kind of expected that. Using a lightweight desktop environment is probably a better idea for a Raspberry Pi anyway, and historically, GNOME just doesn't really work well on slower devices. But then again, the performance wasn't extremely terrible either. It works well enough. So if you want the full Ubuntu desktop experience on a Raspberry Pi, then you can do that. And nothing I just said was specific to the RasPad itself. It'll let you run whatever distribution of Linux you would normally want to run on a Raspberry Pi. But I did decide to try out Ubuntu, so I figured I would tell you guys about my experience. I also tried Ubuntu 2004 as well, and I manually installed the desktop package to see how well that would work on the Pi 4. But in summary, don't do that. Just stick with Ubuntu 2104 or newer if you're going to run Ubuntu on the Pi. There's compatibility issues with the screen and audio on Ubuntu 2004 with this kit. Speaking of audio, with Ubuntu 2104, for some reason, audio would not work for me at all with the RasPad. And that's really weird considering that both Raspberry Pi OS and RetroPie seem to have no problem with audio on this device. But for some reason, with Ubuntu 2104, I just couldn't get audio to work at all. So just keep that in mind if Ubuntu is the distribution that you want to get running on this device. On my end, I didn't have any luck in that area. Now, I really think that this is a cool tablet. I like the fact that we have full USB ports, HDMI, an Ethernet jack, and so on. I mean, how many tablets have all of those ports? Again, there's something really cool about plugging in an Ethernet cable to what's considered a tablet. That's really awesome. I think the RasPad 3 is a really good fit for someone that's looking for a portable development environment, especially since it takes a lot less space than a dedicated display. Also, even if you're not a developer and you just want a portable Linux workstation, it's great for that as well. And since I love classic gaming, running my favorite retro games on this unit was especially fun. RetroPie just runs great on this device, so if you are like me and you just love classic gaming, then you might want to give this a shot, because I think it's one of, if not the best devices for that purpose. And I think that's especially true considering that the alternative is to use a dedicated device like a GPie for this purpose. The GPie is also a portable retro gaming kit that's compatible with the Raspberry Pi and is great for RetroPie purposes, but that device uses a Raspberry Pi Zero, which just can't measure up to the performance of a Raspberry Pi 4. And that means if you were to go with something like that, then a lot of your games just won't work very well at all. But the Raspberry Pi 4, well, that'll run a lot of great games. And another really good use case for the RasPad 3 is introducing children to computer science. And I really wish I had technology like this available to me when I was a kid. I think it's really awesome and amazing that children nowadays have access to really great technologies that will empower their learning, things that I could only dream of when I was a kid. So if you want to introduce a child to the concept of computer science, coding, or just computer engineering in general, then I think this is a great fit for that. In my case, I'm really starting to get into the concept of home automation. And Home Assistant is my platform of choice for that purpose. I really like it quite a bit. And I could totally see the RasPad being a great fit when it comes to home automation because you could essentially use it as a sort of dashboard to control all of your devices in your home. In fact, I'm actually considering buying several of these because I might want one in every single room of the house, or at least all of the common areas, as that'll make it even easier to control all of the lighting and things like that. And who knows, I might even wall mount one of these as well, because that's a really cool idea to have a wall-mounted tablet that is dedicated to Home Assistant, so I can have a control system right there on the wall to make everything easily accessible. Now, before I close out the video, I think it's time to go over all of my pros and cons. I'm going to tell you everything I like about the device and some of the things that I don't like as much. The thing that I love the most about the RasPad is that you have full control over this device. And that might not seem like a big deal to you until you consider that other tablets, such as an iPad or a Chrome OS tablet, those won't allow you to have full control by default unless you hack them. And changing an operating system on a consumer tablet is a chore most of the time. But with the RasPad, it's as simple as just changing the SD card. You have full control over this device, and I think that's amazing. And another thing to add to the list of pros is that if the motherboard or storage goes bad, you can simply replace it. There's no soldered-on storage or proprietary motherboard for this tablet. Since it utilizes a Raspberry Pi board and an SD card, which you could buy pretty much anywhere, if either of those components go bad, then you could just replace those components. Compare that to an iPad or a Chrome OS tablet. If the storage goes on those devices or the motherboard dies, guess what? You're buying an entirely new device. And with the RasPad, you could actually replace those components anytime you'd like. Another really cool thing about the RasPad 3 is that this device has more ports on it than any other tablet I've ever seen. I mean, how many other tablets give you access to 3 USB ports and an Ethernet jack? I mean, that's just crazy to me. I just absolutely love the ports that I have available on this device. And speaking of ports, another pro that I like about this device is that you have access to a full-sized HDMI port. And that's great considering that with the Pi 4 itself, you actually need an adapter in order to use a full-size HDMI cable. But on this device, you have a full HDMI port, and it's just a lot easier to find a USB cable when you need one. And that's especially useful if you are giving a presentation in a boardroom or something like that. You wouldn't need to search for an adapter in order to connect it to an external display. The screen quality overall is really good. Now, yeah, it's not full HD, there's that. But resolution aside, it looks great. The speakers are really good as well. And in my opinion, the speakers are better than in some laptops. And the reason for that could be because the chassis is just so thick, so it's less likely to vibrate. But it sounds good to me, and even though it's a little light in the bass department, it sounds plenty fine for vocals and things like that. So I consider the speakers a pro. Now, let's talk about the cons. As I mentioned several times in this video, this tablet is fairly thick. Again, there's really nothing else they could have done considering that there's a full-sized Raspberry Pi 4 inside, so it is what it is. But if you are making a decision on whether or not to buy this for yourself, you'll have to be okay with a thicker tablet. Earlier, I mentioned that the screen quality is a pro, and it is. It looks really good. However, like I mentioned earlier, it's not full HD either. The resolution, again, is 1280 by 800, so if you are going to buy a RasPad 3 for yourself, you also have to be okay with that resolution. But in my opinion, honestly, the resolution is probably good enough for most of the use cases that you would want to use this particular tablet for. In addition, I'm almost always hearing the fan while the tablet's running. Now, it's not extremely loud, but if you have nothing playing through the speakers, you will hear it. And finally, the last thing that I can think to complain about is the absence of some sort of kickstand or prop. Since this device is thicker than pretty much every other tablet, it's kind of hard to find a prop that fits it. With the stand that I used for some of the B-roll in this video, this tablet fell off that stand once when I barely nudged it, and that's because the only stand that I have assumes a thickness of a typical tablet, so it is what it is. But as long as you account for the thickness of this tablet when you go to order a stand for it, you should be fine. Now, if you want to turn your Raspberry Pi 4 into a portable development workstation or just a generic Linux workstation, it's a great fit for that. Like I mentioned, getting children involved in coding and computer science, it's a great fit for that as well. I enjoyed using this as a retro gaming console. That was pretty cool in addition. Now overall, whether or not you want to use this for its intended purpose of a tablet, that kind of depends on whether or not you care about the thickness. I think it's plenty fine, and I have to say I really love the fact that I have a Linux tablet. I think that's really amazing. Overall, I really enjoy the RasPad 3 and I do recommend it. There are some pros and cons that you have to weigh for yourself to make the decision on whether or not you think this will be a good fit for your use case, but I just love the level of control that I get over this device, being able to change the operating system anytime I'd like. Changing the entire motherboard is a good benefit as well. Well, I mean, yeah, it's a Raspberry Pi 4, and you could buy those anywhere, but that's a major benefit because we really can't do that with other tablets. Other tablets are essentially disposable, but here we have a kit that we can use for whatever use case we can possibly imagine. I think that's awesome. So let me know what you think of the RasPad 3 in the comments down below, and thanks so much for watching.